Constitution? No. Then it's articulated in the laws passed by the legislative body. Okay? So typically you'd have a constitution, or you have essentially law that's been adopted by the legislative body. Okay? And that law serves, or that those rights serve as, they serve as constraints on what government can or can't do within society when it writes and implements law. So if a law goes against the Constitution, that law, if challenged in the legal court, becomes what? Can be, if it's ruled by the Supreme Court or the highest legal body, it would be ruled unconstitutional, right? But the point is, you have to have a law in place, or some sort of statement, or some sort of information out there defining what those rights are, right? That would be interpreted by some legislative or judicial arm. So in terms of protecting human rights, what you have is, and this still really is a matter of a tremendous amount of debate, because you're talking about concepts, okay? You know, so let's say you have a law and you establish a treaty. Does that guarantee that the rights are going to be upheld? What will guarantee whether rights are upheld? The probability of what? Is it illegal to run a red light in Kuwait?
Yes.
Okay, do people run red lights in Kuwait?
Yes.
Okay, so they're breaking the law. So why would they be prepared to break the law? What's that? What's that?
There's penalties.
Yeah, but there's a penalty, but they're still doing it. In Lebanon, you stop at a red light, and there's no one around. You better run the red light, because not only, you know, the reason you run the red light is because your life is in danger. Because the guy behind you may get so upset he'll take out a gun and shoot you because you're not running the red light. Okay, so my point is this. Okay, why are people violating the law?
No one's enforcing them.
The probability of enforcement is key here. There's a whole series of economic literature out there talking about why criminals behave like criminals. And the underlying logic is the probability of getting caught isn't very high. Let me restate that question. You're running a red light in Kuwait. Okay? There's no camera around. Are you likely? Is the probability that you'll run a red light higher than if a camera was around?
Yes.
Of course, because there's a camera and you run the red light. What's going to happen? The camera will take a picture of your license plate, and then the next time you have to renew your license, you'll realize that you have 1,000 KD worth of penalties on your license, right? Has that ever happened to anybody in here? 1,000 KD?
Yeah.
You had 1,000 KD. Really?
Yeah.
How many years?
2 years.
2 years. My goodness, you don't pay attention to where the cameras are? I've had one student, it was a guy. You have 1,000, wow. Okay, all right, so the point that I'm trying to emphasize here is that once you have a law, it doesn't necessarily mean that law is going to be followed. And a lot of it has to do with enforceability. Okay, that is now if it's a law that multiple countries, or if it's a treaty that multiple countries sign, how are you going to how can these countries enforce these treaties? What do they need?
Strong government.
They need. Well, I'm sorry.
Strong government.
But that's okay if you're paying attention to your law within your nation state. What are we talking about here?
Law enforcement.
Well, how is international law enforced? What are one way for laws to be enforced? You need to have what? Guys, it must be a bad day. You guys aren't thinking. Maybe I'm not being clear enough. If you have multiple countries entering into an agreement, someone has to make sure that agreement is followed, right? Right?
Yeah.
Laws are enforced. typically would do that? Well, in this, when we think of, initially, that you said the country, right? Well, we're talking about how many countries here? Whoever signed essentially the law, correct?
UN, is it the UN?
Well, you'd have to have an intergovernmental organization. You'd have to have some sort of international regime with the powers delegated or powerful enough to enforce that law.
Well, they're not very effective.
Huh?
They're not very effective.
Oh, WTO is pretty effective, okay? But the effectiveness usually is where? When it comes to economics. But when you're coming to human rights, yes, you're right. Although you have the Hague, right? You have the Human Rights Court, okay? But typically the Human Rights Court is typically used whenever it's in the country's interest, or a country agrees to basically abide by the Human Rights Court. A common approach is humanitarian intervention, and that is you have NGOs. Yes?
When you say international regimes with enforcement powers, who are
Yeah.
the enforcement powers?
Well, an intergovernmental organization. So let's say, for example, you have the United Nations, the peacekeeping force, conclude. Okay, that would be an example. All right. You have the International Human Rights Court. That would be part of an international regime that has the ability to take someone, try them, and actually put and convict them life imprisonment. But the key here is whenever you're dealing with laws or concepts that are global in nature, it's no longer a matter of a country using its sovereign rights to adhere or to enforce a law. We're talking about an entity that can enforce laws that governs all the members that have essentially signed the treaty or belong to or have agreed to follow the regime that's responsible for implementing or monitoring the law, such as an example of intergovernmental organization. Okay? But humanitarian intervention is typically, I mean, what would be, and humanitarian intervention would be examples of NGOs, right? And Doctors Without Borders, the Red Crescent, all these different, the Red Cross, if you're on the Christian side, the Red Crescent, on the Islamic side, okay? So you have these kinds of, or humanitarian aid, okay? These are ways to deal with issues in terms of protecting human rights. Okay? These are just some examples of different, as you see, you know, if you take a look, you have, 2000 Convention Poverty, Trafficking of Women and Children for Prostitution, 1997 Universal Declaration of Human Genome and Human Rights. So you have, these are just examples of declarations that people have signed, and they, by the signature, have agreed to adhere to when when those laws are in question. Okay? All right, so that's enough for human development. Let's take a look at the next chapter. The next chapter is the environment. I haven't talked to you. I'll do a little bit, and maybe you can think about it for Wednesday.
That's fine.
Okay, I'm sorry, I just...
It's a busy time.
I hear you. Okay. Now, the environment is, environment is a pretty problematic area to cover, because what exactly is environmental policy? What exactly do we mean by environmental law? What do we mean by the environment and politics? Any kind of policy stuff, any kind of focus on a policy issue becomes very complicated when the term itself covers a broad range of factors. And environmental law, environmental policy, environmental issues is a classic case of how complicated it is to kind of get your handle on what we mean by the environment and how countries can deal with environmental issues, or how governments themselves, because environmental issues can have can be local concerns just as well as they can be global concerns, right? Now, since this is a course in international relations, we're talking about environmental issues that have global consequences. In other words, it's a problem that requires a group of countries to get together to resolve. If you have a local issue, let's say near a lake, or you have an issue near a coastline, which happens to, maybe coastline could cover the extent of the coastline, which could encompass a group of countries, but let's say you're dealing with a lake, and the lake is basically borders two states in the United States, then it becomes a state issue. A lake within a community becomes a local issue, all right? But the best way that I try to or the way I want to approach this particular chapter is really kind of define what this issue is called environment and politics, or environmental politics. Well, typically when we talk about the environment, and we talk about the role of government vis-a-vis the environment, it's really a conflict between man and nature. Or that's how I like to discuss it. And that is